First of all, kia ora, hello, and welcome to all of you on behalf of the UC Centre for Entrepreneurship. We exist to provide students studying in any discipline at any level opportunities to grow their creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial skill sets. We work with students who want to have an impact in the world by providing a supportive yet challenging environment so that they can make things happen. I'd also like to particularly thank all of you who've submitted questions in advance for this webinar. We have a range of really interesting ideas to explore over the next hour or so. What's going to happen is I'm going to briefly introduce Anzac, who will be asking questions on your behalf, and Rod, who will be answering those questions. And then Rod will sort of open the proceedings by giving some background about the Climate Change Commission and New Zealand's place in the world regarding climate change. The bulk of the session will then be a question and answer between Anzac and Rod. You should feel free to submit questions throughout the session via Zoom or via the Facebook live stream. I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we'll be picking out some of the ones that come through to be asked as well. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Anzac. So Anzac was one of our most recent cohort through the UCE Summer Startup Program. He was working on a venture he co-founded called the Grow Up Group. His venture is focused on improving environmental awareness and science education in primary schools. And recently, Anzac and his co-founder Jack were awarded the Dream Believe Succeed Prize. So they secured more than $40,000 in cash and in-kind support to help take the Grow Up Group to the next level. I'm really excited to see what they do with it. I know that there's sort of big things in the works. He's also recently was on an expedition to the Antarctic, just as the world was shutting down and locking down and borders were closing. So we're really lucky he managed to hightail it back to South America and make it back to New Zealand while that was still just barely an option. My next introduction, Rod Carr, Chair of the New Zealand Climate Change Commission. Some of you will best remember Rod for his time as Vice Chancellor at the University of Canterbury, others for his time at the Reserve Bank, where he prefers to go by past chairman of the board rather than an ex-deputy governor. But he's also recently served in governance roles with the Christchurch Earthquake Appeals Trust, the Christchurch Arts Centre, Otakaro, and the ASB. He has done a few more things, but the list is long and I'm sure all of us are just about ready to move on. Before I finish, and only because it seems to be the done thing when introducing him, I would like to point out that Rod has in fact completed 23 marathons, including an Antarctic marathon, New York, Easter Island, North Korea, and most recently, the Polar Circle Marathon in Greenland. So as I hand over to Rod, I'd like to thank you all again for being here and encouraging you to keep submitting questions throughout this session. So Rod.
Kia ora, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to all of you. The Climate Change Commission was born late last year by Act of Parliament. A bill that was known as the Zero Carbon Bill changed the Climate Change Response Act of 2002, embedding in our domestic legislation our net zero target for 2050. And at the same time establishing the Climate Change Commission as an independent, evidence-based entity to provide advice to governments of the day about how New Zealand would achieve its target through the provision of advice on 5 yearly emissions budgets and emissions reduction plans. The Commission also has the obligation in due course to create the second National Risk Assessment, the first one being created by the Ministry for the Environment as we speak, and also the role of the Commission is in reviewing the National Adaptation Plan, which will be prepared in due course by the Ministry for the Environment. So most of the work of the Commission at present is in gathering the facts and engaging with stakeholders to build those first 3 5-yearly carbon emissions budgets and to provide the emissions reduction plans that would be necessary to ensure New Zealand had its best chance of being on track to a net zero CO2 equivalence emission by 2050. So many people ask two important questions. Well, surely New Zealand's contribution to greenhouse gases is so small that it doesn't really matter what we do, and maybe we should just spend all our time on adapting to the changing world. And I think the second question is always, given the very large proportion of New Zealand's greenhouse gases that comes from agriculture and New Zealand's contribution to feeding the world, what is the point in reducing emissions if we only push them somewhere else where to feed the world we have higher emissions than we would if we fed part of the world from New Zealand? So those are two questions. Let me address the first one first. It is true that New Zealand's gross CO2 emissions are about 80 million tonnes per annum of CO2 equivalent, about 16 tonnes for each and every New Zealander. The world emits 55 billion metric tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents every year. That means our share of that is about 0.17 of 1%. However, 100 little countries like us all emit less than 1%. That the 100 little countries can't all get a free ride. And in fact, even the United Kingdom's emissions are only 1% of the global total. The reality is that we have built our way of life, what we produce and how we produce it, what we consume and how we choose to live our lives, and embedded fossil fuels emissions throughout our way of living. That therefore every one of us as individuals, as households, as communities, as nation states, as regions, must play our part. There is no shoving this off to someone else. On the agricultural emissions, there is no doubt that the agricultural emissions are challenging. Part of those emissions relate to CO2 itself, and that part of the sector which emits CO2 is going to find ways, like the rest of society, to reduce its emissions of carbon dioxide. The more challenging one is what's known as biogenic methane emissions. It is the ruminant animals and the processing of pasture lands into useful meat and protein, milk and other products that causes those emissions. Much research and science is underway around the world about how to address and reduce emissions. There is no doubt that we are already reducing emissions per unit of output, but as the output is increasing to feed a hungry world, total agricultural emissions globally and locally continue to rise. So with that and that introduction, I'm going to throw to Anzac to put the first question. Anzac.
Fantastic, thank you very much for that. And I suppose also on that point of 100 countries having 1% of emissions, you know, we're relying on that percent being covered elsewhere in all of the, you know, I guess inputs that we rely on and the functioning of the rest of the world as well. So yeah, I mean, first of all, also a huge thank you to yourself and James for putting this together. It's such a cool opportunity to be able to ask, you know, you directly, someone with so much experience and knowledge in this field, these questions. So thanks also to everyone who submitted questions. We're inevitably probably not going to get through all of them, but also in saying that, reminder that you can still submit them as we go along. But yeah, with that, we'll jump right into the first one. And so that's around consumer kind of consciousness, and someone's wanting to know what's more important in terms of when we're choosing our habits of consumption, consuming less, and they've provided examples of like less plastic, less fast fashion, etc., or consuming better in terms of local, organic, and ethical kind of produce?
So Anzac, it won't surprise you to sort of hear me say, look, it's actually both rather than either or. The thing we can do, given where New Zealand is in terms of relative income, is as a nation, we can waste less. We can choose to consume less. And that doesn't mean every individual and every household, because some households in New Zealand, quite frankly, should be empowered and enabled to consume more. But there are other households that would unambiguously benefit by just consuming less, by making clothes last longer, by making sure we do our best to recycle, by avoiding avoidable waste. But it is also true that over time, purely reducing is not going to get us where we need to be. We do need to change what we produce, how we produce it, what we consume, and what our preferences are. But let's get started on both. Let's get started now, and whatever we do, let's do more of it.
Awesome, fantastic. And sort of flipping that last question on its head a little bit, you know, we've seen through this kind of special time to be discussing climate change, you know, we've seen a dramatic drop in consumption, you know, less air travel, less local travel with vehicles, potentially less consumption overall. And, you know, despite all that and, you know, seeing the kind of most rapid and most significant drop in carbon emissions in human history of what's estimated to be perhaps 5.5% in global kind of average by the end of the year, you know, despite that, you know, comparing that to a 7.6 recommended reduction year after year after year for this next decade, do you think that really provides a lot to the argument that, you know, it's actually not, you know, that change isn't best achieved through consumer kind of preferences and power of the wallet, but rather more so through kind of the industry itself and the government kind of enforcing kind of change?
So Anzac, I think you put your finger on a really important reality, is that even shutting down air travel almost entirely and severely constraining mobility on the ground and everybody's staying home, the reduction of 5 to 7% in annual CO2 emissions tells us that there is a lot of work to be done on the what we produce and how we produce it. And that while consumers need to express preferences for goods and services that have low carbon emitted in their production, we need to fundamentally change how we produce our travel and transport services, how we produce our food, how we go about heating our houses and our businesses, and how we generate the heat needed in industrial processes. So all of those things we do need to change, and they will take time to change. But absolutely right to observe that to hit our targets, we need to reduce annual emissions by over 7% per annum each and every year for the next decade. And that's just to be on target. That's not even to achieve the target. This is going to require fundamental changes to industrial processes and the way we live.
And ultimately it shows how mammoth of an effort that's going to be. But obviously we all know how necessary that is. And so a next question kind of stemming from that is, you know, what else can we really learn from this kind of experience and through the COVID lockdown in NZ, but also globally? I guess something that's been on my mind is, you know, what is that an indicator of in terms of how resilient we might be to climate events in the future? You know, and thinking of other examples too, say for the Christchurch earthquakes, when that has such a huge impact on the rest of our economy, a kind of a freak event, although not related to climate change. You know, what does that mean for us moving forwards in the future when we're getting sort of these climate events?
Well, I think one thing I can take from the COVID experience is that as a community, New Zealand has swung in behind a number of things that are very important. The first thing is that we look to science and evidence to inform our policies, and our leaders accept the role that science and evidence can play. Now, that is not to say that there won't be legitimate dispute and debate about the science and the evidence. That is always what we need to do, is challenge the science, challenge the evidence, go looking for validation and verification. But it is reassuring to know that New Zealand as a society continues to hold the scientific method, evidence-based public policy decision-making by our leaders in high regard. So that, I think, is a plus. I think the second thing is that the daunting thing about climate change is it doesn't ever feel imminent. COVID felt imminent. We were seeing people get the disease around the world and die from the disease in real time. The challenge with climate change is failure is not imminent, but potentially inevitable. And galvanizing action for something which doesn't seem as imminent and urgent as COVID is the challenge that we all face. Public policymakers, voters, political leaders, industry leaders. The challenge is, without panicking, how do you galvanize urgent, immediate action? Because if we don't start now, and we should have started sooner, the problem only gets harder later. And the manifestation of it in terms of either droughts, floods, inundations, diseases, let alone the loss of species and ecology and environmental contexts for our lives, may be irreversible.
And I suppose that directly kind of ties into this next question in terms of, you know, is this the best time or the worst time to be fighting action on or fighting for action on climate? You know, we see these immense stimulus packages coming out from, you know, governments globally, and, you know, Greenpeace released their kind of proposal last week in terms of, okay, how do we direct that towards, you know, investing in kind of a green economy and, you know, for example, regenerative agriculture. You know, is this a time of opportunity in that sense? And like you're saying with, you know, this is a time where we're listening to the science evidence and taking action, and all of New Zealand's getting behind it. Is that something that we can potentially continue that momentum and convert it almost into climate change action?
So Anzac, the first thing is the best time to act was 30 years ago. There's no doubt that the best time has passed. We have made this harder by waiting. We've made it harder by kicking the can down the road to the now. So a better time to act is now than tomorrow. So any day is a good day. Now is better than tomorrow. With COVID, you're right, there are opportunities with spare capacity in the economy to direct resources to address some of the mitigation and adaptation issues that we will have to do. So the Climate Change Commission wrote a letter, which was public, that outlines 6 principles that should be borne in mind as the government moves to use stimulus to get people back to work and jobs that are meaningful. And top of that list of principles was, look at these opportunities through a climate change lens. And the second principle was essentially a principle that says, bring forward and do now things that for sure we are going to have to do later. And that's particularly around adaptation. So we have got principles. The principles, I think, are relevant to decision making. And there is an opportunity as a result of slack in the economy to get people to work on addressing issues now that will be easier addressed today than they will be in 2030.
So I guess then comes the question of you know, how do you like ensure that that's the case in terms of you know, holding government accountable, but then also gaining that kind of movement and support from the public to really keep, as you're saying, climate change in the forefront of our minds as we're sort of looking to come out of this.
Yeah. So as a Western liberal democracy, you're absolutely right. It's us. We can't just say them, the leaders. We have to say us. What can we do to give our political leaders the backbone to make hard choices with us and for us and on our behalf, when inevitably we have rewarded politicians in the past for not addressing those hard choices? If we continue not to hold our leaders to account and not to elect leaders who will take hard choices around climate, then we have only ourselves to blame in our democracy. we all get the opportunity to vote. We all get the opportunity to communicate with our elected representatives. We all get the opportunity to help them reprioritize now and urgently addressing the impacts of climate change and reducing our impact on the climate.
Fantastic. So I guess then, although we've partially covered this, another question here, what then is the Commission's role in the COVID recovery plans?
So the Commission's role is very clear. We're advisory. We have no instruments that we could use to incentivize or tax, to regulate, to ban, prohibit, or anything. We advise the government of the day, and that advice comes in the form of the targets or emissions budgets and the emissions reduction plans, which is the advice on how to achieve those targets, and the review of the National Adaptation Plan. So in the tightly narrowed defined sense, you can say we are only advisory, but we have a couple of other responsibilities as well. One is under the Act, we have to be transparent about what we do. The Act is very, very clear about the need for us to engage with stakeholders and communities and to consult with them about our advice and to provide the advice having consulted with stakeholders to the government of the day, who is not under an obligation to accept our advice, but if they don't accept the advice, they are under an obligation to say what they're going to do instead. So part of the whole regime is transparency to bring accountability, and then to set up a perpetual lived institution to monitor and measure progress and report not just to the government of the day in secret, but to all New Zealanders about our progress in meeting that legislative target. So the whole role of the Commission is both technical, but also to create leadership. So we were not asked to provide our letter of 6 principles. We volunteered that as a way of saying, here is an opportunity, here are 6 guiding principles for multi-billion-dollar infrastructure spend. We know there'll be a temptation to hit the button on projects that look like old projects because they're familiar, that look like projects you would have seen 20 years ago because we know how to do them, because we can engage labour fast. But this may not be the time, and they may not be the right projects. And let's make certain we take the opportunity to fund projects which will make us in a better position to reduce emissions and adapt to a changing climate.
Fantastic. I really like that almost ultimatum too, in terms of, okay, well, either take on board our advice or, you know, present what you're going to do otherwise. And there's not really an option for a lack of action. So I really like that one there. Our next question here, we've got, how's the Climate Change Commission working with Indigenous communities in their mahi?
Yeah, extremely important. So the legislation is very clear that our partnership with iwi Māori is centre to the way in which we need to generate our advice. The Deputy Chair of the Climate Change Commission, Lisa Tumahai, is the kaiwhakahaere of Ngāi Tahu, and obviously on the iwi leaders group. So there's a direct connection at governance level. Within the Commission, we have full-time employees who are responsible for developing our iwi Māori engagement strategy. So it's still early days. But as a long life to perpetual institution, we want to develop in partnership with iwi Māori both the protections that the treaty requires, but also the participation and partnership that will go to first understanding Te Ao Māori's lens on climate and the environment, and using that understanding to develop advice which is going to be actionable. There's no point in having great advice and theory from a desk in Wellington if out in the real world, in the front line of where communities live and behave, that advice cannot be implemented for want of resources or education and training or capacity. So the advice needs to be informed by those about whom we are talking.
I guess then there, do you see kind of like a then a need or a gap in terms of, you know, you have the delivery of that advice, but then where is sort of that body to kind of enforce those solutions and implement those solutions themselves?
So that was one of the questions around where are the enforcement powers? And I think the first thing to remember is the Climate Commission cannot be all things climate. There's a risk if it were, and that would be that people say, oh, the Climate Commission will fix the climate. But like my 5-year-old granddaughter who said, Granddad's going to fix the planet. I don't think so, right? I think that we all need to accept that responsibility. The only enforcement that you can actually guarantee will happen in a democracy is enforcement that is the will of the people. And that means that we as consumers, every day we buy something, are expressing a preference. Where we choose to work and how we hold our employers accountable can change the world. And who we elect and what platforms they're elected on can change the world. So that idea that we're all too little and any one of us alone can't make a difference, what we buy, where we work, and who we vote for are three very powerful levers.
Fantastic. And sort of tying into that, our next question, in order to prevent the most serious impacts of climate change, governments across the world must act in an urgent and unified way. And then this seems unlikely. What is New Zealand's role in the international community from a climate perspective? And then sort of following on from that, do you have any notes on sort of how New Zealand specifically will be impacted by climate change compared to the rest of the world?
Yeah. So on the first one, I think New Zealand can be a good global citizen, and don't underestimate the importance of being a good global citizen. And by being a good global citizen, you get a seat at the table, you get to be in the room, you get to influence global policy. And New Zealand is a non-threatening nation in the world that typically seeks to avoid polarizing views and is respected because we are an evidence-based community of thoughtful people, known for our creativity and our flexibility and adaptability. What New Zealand does isn't necessarily the right answer for everyone else. What is right for everyone else is not necessarily going to be appropriate for New Zealand. But the role New Zealand can play in the world is to model good behavior and to seek to engage with the world to change behaviors and to benefit from learning from others about what we can do in New Zealand, both to reduce emissions and to adapt. Which leads me to the second part of your question is, so what is climate change going to do to New Zealand? NIWA have done quite a lot of work on what a warmer, wetter, drier, windier world will mean, because that's essentially what climate change is. It's warmer in some places, wetter in some places, drier in some places, windier in some places. We can look at sea level rise and the impact on nearshore infrastructure and communities. But it's not just about sea level rise. Rain will fall and accumulate in lakes and rivers. As we saw in Wanaka, they may be well inland, but lake level rise threatened their town. As we see when flooding rivers erode banks and communities on riverbanks, that it's not enough just to not be on the coast. We are going to find that the water blasting of the west coast occurs more frequently, and dryness on the east coast occurs more frequently. Adaptation may mean we have to move water to where it's needed or move agriculture to where the water is, but it's going to change. And that is why climate change, rather than just necessarily global warming, is the right way. It may be that the warmer atmosphere is warming the oceans and that is causing the climate to change, but it will manifest itself in local communities in different ways.
Immense change either way then. Another question we've had submitted during the call. What would you say to the government of a developing nation that wants to continue to leverage the cheap and deeply embedded nature of fossil fuels in our existing global economy to industrialize in the face of international consensus that this is environmentally unsustainable? Essentially, the right to industrial revolution, I guess, is the question there.
Yes, and I think we have to unpack that right to progress, the right to develop income levels that can sustain health and education and prosperity from the pathway that we all took. So we took a particular pathway using fossil fuels in great volumes with significant externalities, dumping our waste into the oceans and the atmosphere. You cannot simply say to the less developed nations, you cannot become rich and prosperous. It is our duty to help those nations use renewable energy sources in place of high-emitting fossil fuels. It is our responsibility to make sure there is indeed an alternative pathway to prosperity that doesn't involve high emissions over long periods of time. And if that means we have to have income and wealth transfers and gift technology to less developed nations to save the planet, then that's what we should do.
Fantastic. Another question here, following on from that one. What are our special obligations to our Pacific neighbours in particular?
So the Climate Change Commission has not developed policy or advice on that matter. It turns out Tuvalu is counted in New Zealand's emissions. So there is a very special case of a Pacific island in which we are absolutely unambiguously accountable for supporting their transition. But I personally believe we have a significant responsibility to the peoples of the Pacific. Partly because if we don't, who will? Partly because they are vulnerable island nations, largely that have not had the same economic benefit from industrialization that New Zealand has had. And in addition, I do believe that it is in New Zealand's interest to best understand those communities for regional security and prosperity.
So then, is that something that the Commission is looking at sort of addressing and discussing and putting together in the future?
It's not necessarily in the mandate for the Commission. As we say, the Act prescribes precisely what the Commission must do, but also leaves open for the Commission to be asked by ministers to do additional things. So most recently, we have been asked to review our nationally determined contributions to see whether those contributions are consistent with our domestic legislation, because our NDCs were determined as part of the Paris negotiations prior to the New Zealand government setting a net zero target. The Minister has also asked that we look at the methane target and see whether that is consistent with our domestic and international obligations. So the Minister might choose to add other areas of inquiry for the Commission, but at this stage, the special responsibility to the Pacific lies elsewhere in the organs of government.
Sure. So in that sense, where ministers are sort of asking the Commission to focus on particular kind of subjects. Does that mean then it's sort of up to kind of public pressure to even put the pressure on for those questions to be asked and those kind of tasks to be given to the Commission?
Yes, although you have to remember the Commission is not the largest organ of government, and we're pretty stretched giving
sure. Okay, yeah,
the responsibilities that we already have. So I think you'd have to ask whether we are the best agent to provide advice to the government on such a matter as our regional responsibilities, which go well beyond just climate and emissions. Our responsibilities to the Pacific are many, varied and quite complicated, and many organs of government which would be better equipped to provide advice than the Climate Change Commission.
Gotcha, right. So we've got quite a few questions here on carbon credits, which I think is particularly interesting. Obviously kind of highly discussed. And sort of the conversation around climate change, but then also coming out of COVID, potentially some interesting developments to happen there. I wondered if you might give kind of a brief overview of what the New Zealand system is of carbon credits.
So it's called the Emissions Trading Scheme. It was born in the early part of the century. And when it was born out of the Kyoto Protocol, which sought to establish a global market for carbon credits, a sort of a cap and trade regime where you would find the globally best place to produce things with the least emissions and the globally best place to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and that calibration would be set through an international price of a unit of emitted carbon dioxide equivalent. So that was the architecture that was dreamed of. Of course, many dreams don't come to fruition. There were some failings in that original scheme, including the creation of what became to be known as pretty fraudulent credits, which swamped the schemes both at national and global level. So in about 2015, New Zealand closed our domestic scheme to international credits. You couldn't use international credits to offset your New Zealand emissions obligations, and you haven't been able to for the last 4 or 5 years. And under the proposed reforms of the emissions trading scheme currently being contemplated, while it will be possible in the future, it is not desirable in the near future to allow unfettered access to international credit. So there are provisions which would allow that in the future, but not immediately. So the consequence of that was that the NZU, as it's known, the New Zealand unit, which is 1 unit of CO2 equivalence emissions, the unit value has fluctuated wildly from a collapsed value when fraudulent credits were washing the system to a peak value nearly of $30 per NZU, which is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide emission equivalents. The scheme proposed to be will have a floor of $20 a tonne, and for 1 year, a government price of $35 a tonne, and a reserve of units held to stop the price going far above $50 a tonne in the first 3 to 5 years of the scheme. Currently, because the oil price collapsed, the NZU secondary market, which is pretty thinly traded, is pricing units in the range of $22 to $24 a unit. Now, at that price, not much changes because that has been around the $25 price at which emitters have been able to buy unlimited numbers of NZUs for the last 4 or 5 years. But even at $50 an NZU, the estimate is that the New Zealand's households impact is modest. So for the lowest decile of households, households that earn the least 10% of income effectively, for those households, the estimate from the Ministry for the Environment is that would add about $2.40 per week to their annual account. So, basically something in the order of $110 a year would be their, quote, carbon cost. And for a top decile household, which obviously spends more on different things, it's about $3.50 per week. So the consequence of all of that is that the NZU price is unlikely to dramatically affect what you and I at the household level would consume. That the fluctuating oil price has created more volatility in the petrol price than would be created by the likely movements in an NZU price. What is likely, though, is that large emitters will take into account the price of carbon in determining, for example, the choice about renewables versus fossil fuels in the generation of electricity, or the use of heat exchangers and non-emitting technologies where applicable in process heat. So there is work for an emissions trading scheme to do. There is work a carbon price can do, but the UK experience is that pricing carbon at levels that are socially and politically acceptable throughout the economy probably does 10% of the work that needs to be done. And that throws you back to consumer preferences. We choose not to buy certain things because of their embedded carbon, not because we can't afford them. We choose to pay more for things because they have less embedded carbon. We choose rather than we can't because we can't afford to pay the price. Alternatively, the government may regulate. It may simply say, there is no price at which you are allowed to burn coal in an open fire. There is no price at which you are allowed to emit carbon from a yet to be built nickel smelter. So, those are the kinds of regulatory environments which simply ban certain things from happening. And other regulation can, over time, mean that we don't import internal combustion engine cars that emit high levels of fossil fuel from their fuel. Right? So the price does some of the work, the regulation does some of the work, and consumer preferences does some of the work.
I guess ultimately then it's about everything at once, I guess.
Need all of these tools.
Brilliant. And something I guess that you sort of touched on there briefly in terms of in relation to COVID as well. There's a lot of concern around fossil fuels in particular with their price at the moment, and predictions that the use of fossil fuels will actually, we'll actually see an increase potentially quite dramatically following kind of lockdown and the end of lockdown. So much so that our effect on reducing emissions from the lockdown will be cancelled out. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that in terms of.
Yeah, so look, there's no doubt there's going to be a bounce back, right? The reality is the lockdown levels of emissions are not sustainable given our industrial society of today. We're not going to lock it down at that low level. There will be a bounce back. I think the jury is still well and truly out, and only with the benefit of hindsight will we ever know to what extent have behaviours changed, not just in a transient way, but in a permanent way. To what extent will work from home become somewhat more prevalent sooner than it might otherwise have been? To what extent will long distance travel for short duration stays become less of an acceptable way of spending your holiday time or your business conference time? And I think some of those will be transient, but some of them may be permanent. How much work they will do to reduce global emissions alone, I'm not certain. There's no doubt that the lower oil price is particularly unhelpful in dictating the cost and benefit cases for renewable energy, but equally the value and pricing of renewables is coming down dramatically. So we've seen over the last decade in the United States an 80% reduction in the cost of solar generation and a 40% reduction in the cost of wind generation. So at these levels, in the US, it looks like you will begin to shut down coal-fired power stations and never build another one. And that's with known technologies at known price. The reduction in oil price, I think, was inevitable, but I didn't see it coming and didn't see COVID as the cause. And why I say it's inevitable is we can't burn all the oil in the ground. And there was always a risk as we moved to renewables technologies that the owners of the oil in the ground would race to turn it into money as quickly as they could before it got locked in the ground forever. And that painted a picture of essentially a last gasp rush to drop the price of oil and pump the quantities before the game was over. Now, is that inevitable? Probably. Could we avoid it? Only by regulation. The market incentives would be to pump till the last day you were allowed to. And when we look at the costs of production of oil, they are significantly lower than they would need to be to underpin a change away from fossil emissions from burning oil. So I think the world is going to have to confront the reality that low oil prices simply should not be allowed.
Right. So we've got a series of quick fire questions here. The first of which will be interesting and answers how you like, I guess. How can a man called Carr be in charge of the Climate Change Commission?
Yeah, 2 hours helps. No, this particular car has never driven a car. I have spent my entire life ride sharing or riding public transport or walking because I'm actually partially sighted and wouldn't get a license, and probably that's a great protection from all the rest of you. But good question.
Fantastic. If anything, like a reason to be in charge of.
Yeah, indeed. The carless car.
On that note. Next one, a little bit more serious. Can we make producers / retailers responsible for the true cost of their packaging? I guess then touching on consumer responsibility versus sort of regulations and producer responsibility.
Yeah, well, I think we should. I think it's a simple answer is yes, we should. So the answer is, can we? Yes, we can. Should we? Yes, we should. But it shouldn't just apply to packaging. I think whole of life costing is something that's been thought about and talked about for a long time. There's no economist who believes in markets who doesn't understand market failure and externalities. And so even those who strongly believe in allowing consumer preference through market pricing to choose the allocation of resources know and understand the limits of markets. And if you don't price in waste and you allow it to be dumped into the oceans and the atmosphere, then someone else is left with the cost of cleanup or the consequences of the mess. So strong believers in markets would believe that you don't have a right to pollute, you have a right to a clean environment, and that the polluters and the consumers should pay the full costs of the cleanup.
Fantastic. And you sort of touched on this in your introduction in terms of, discussing New Zealand's contribution internationally, as well as sort of our agricultural emissions and some the perspectives around that. What is your biggest frustration with the way people talk about climate change in New Zealand?
Possibly one frustration is they don't talk enough. And also we need to move the debate. The reality is that this climate science is now well enough understood for us to know that we're dancing on the head of the pin, whether we're arguing, are New Zealand's gross emissions 81 million tonnes per annum or 79 million tonnes per annum? Are our methane emissions 42% of the total CO2 equivalent emissions or 37%? Quite frankly, the science will evolve and get better. We will get better at measuring. We will get better understanding of how our behaviours interact with the environment. But there is unambiguous evidence that the way we produce goods and services and the way we consume them is unsustainable the way we live our lives today. So if we want to continue to have the kind of lifestyles in the places that we have it, then we have to change what we produce and how we produce it, what we consume. And that is the reality that we should focus our talking about, is now is the time to change. What are we going to change? And how do we, not you, but we, get that change underway now? And I think that's where the conversation needs to go. It's not an option because of COVID to kick things down the road for another 5 years. The climate didn't notice COVID. It might have had a slight reprieve from our impact on it, but the impact from the last 200 years of industrialization is not fixed by a 5 or 6% reduction in emissions for 1 year. And
sort of kind of off of that point, there's a study done following 2008 global financial crisis that showed the public perception of the danger of climate change dramatically reduced following the financial crisis, and potentially simply because economic stability was just more of a focus, and whether or not that was a subconscious thing to worry less about climate change. So I guess what then would be your thoughts on ensuring that that isn't the case following, once we're kind of getting out of this COVID situation?
Well, look, there's no doubt when there's an imminent threat to lives and livelihoods, that communities will respond to that imminent threat. And in democracies, we will empower our leaders to act on that imminent threat. What we've got to do is, while reacting to the imminent threat, make sure we continue the focus on how do we use our reaction to get 2 for 1? How do we use our reaction to the imminent threat of the virus to not only address the virus and our vulnerability to it, but address our vulnerability to climate change? Because if you can do both, you don't have to give up one to do the other. And I think that's why the advice coming from around the world is there are ways in doing both of these things. There are ways in creating stimulus that creates employment and meaningful work that can also reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. What we shouldn't do is, in the name of stimulus, build more dumb things in dumb places.
Absolutely. And our next question here: if you could get everyone on the planet to change something, give something up or adopt a new practice, what would it be?
I suspect it would be to think longer term, that we have spent essentially the last century, the last 100 years, driving economic growth with ever shortening horizons about what we care about most, whether it's public companies with quarterly return reports, because our shareholders and investors have insisted on that and rewarded that, whether it's our political leaders who have been rewarded for very short-term policies, sugar hits that make us feel good on the day. And we get what we choose to buy, and if we choose to buy things that have high levels of embedded emitted carbon, then our industrial processes will produce more of those things. So I think that the challenge for all of us is to accept that each of us every day, as I said before, in what we buy, where we work, and who we vote for, is actually changing the future. And if we chose to preference the future more than the immediate presence for the benefit of unborn generations to come, then we would make a series of different choices than we are currently making or have made in the recent past.
Fantastic. Our next question here I might tie into two. So what are some of the issues we will have to face if we electrify ground transport and space heating? So I guess suggestion of increased power demand, because a few questions down, there's also one around the potential role of nuclear power in New Zealand. And I guess I would extend that to, what are your thoughts on that globally as well?
Okay, so look, the first thing is that currently New Zealand generates about 85% of its electricity from renewables, and that's hydro, wind, solar, and we count geothermal kind of in there, although there are CO2 emissions from that process, so we kind of get a little bit, but yeah. If we electrify ground transportation and a large proportion of process heat for industry, then some of the estimates are that we would need to nearly double our electricity generation capacity. And if at the same time we are trying to reach 100% renewables, you can see the challenge is all of the new stuff has to be renewables and 15% of current has to be displaced by renewables. Now, the challenge for renewables is New Zealand has a reluctance to dam any more flowing rivers. It has a reluctance to flex the lake level heights on existing hydro lakes. We have a reluctance to build large-scale wind farms anywhere in line of sight. And we have a reluctance to have hillsides covered with solar panel arrays. We seem to have a reluctance to do the things because we think we don't have to do any of the above. The challenge for us is to acknowledge that what we don't want to do is burn coal. What we want to minimize is the role of gas in our electricity generation. And what we want to do is increase the amount of electricity used in ground transportation, process, and home heating. We're going to have to choose some bundles of renewables. There is some more geothermal we can get. There is some wind for sure that we can get that is economic now to get. There will be some solar, which is economic to get. There may be some new hydro we need to be prepared to undertake. And in dry years, we may need to be more flexible about lake levels and hydro lakes. It would be nice if we didn't have to do any of those things, but we are going to do some of most of those things if we are going to get the benefits of getting fossil fuels out of ground transportation and home heating. As to nuclear, I think New Zealand does not need nuclear power, but the world does. Consequence may be that some industrial processes that are high emitting because they use fossil fuels today will move to nation states that are willing and able to deploy nuclear power as a source of energy. That may well be the future of nuclear power. It's not onshore in New Zealand, but it may be some of our industrial processes in the decarbonisation of New Zealand's emissions move to countries where nuclear power is acceptable.
Sure. And then our next question here, what does a climate conscious tourism industry look like? And I guess expanding on that, there's a lot of discussion around here at the moment in terms of, we're seeing the tourism industry being a bit volatile in terms of COVID-19.
Collapse would be a good description.
Pretty much. And, a lot of comments about, well, how can that actually be possibly sustainable moving into the future? So your thoughts on that, I guess?
Well, I think the thing is to remember history. So back in 1980, which is kind of like the day Noah was building the ark for some people, there were 400,000 international tourists came to New Zealand, and last year 4 million came. So, that's quite a big difference, right, between 400,000 and 4 million. And we have built the infrastructure, well, almost the infrastructure, to support that tourist venture. And we've certainly created hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of income to New Zealand by hosting international visitors. It is the case that the carbon footprint of long-haul aircraft has been reducing per aircraft and per passenger mile flown, but many, many, many more people have been flying and longer distances. The opportunity to use biofuels in long-haul aviation is real, but at a multiple of the current price of aviation fuel. So one part of responsible tourism might be to insist on biofuels and acknowledge that that will mean a smaller volume of people can travel because it is more expensive, because you've essentially avoided the externalities of dumping fossil fuel waste into the atmosphere. Secondly, it is likely that you would want tourists who travel a long way to stay longer, so that the carbon footprint per day stay is lower than it would be for short stay visits. So thinking responsibly about in and out on a day, high carbon footprint per day. In for a year or two, or in for 3 months or 6 months, or a 1 year gap year, may be much more acceptable because of the benefits of a globally aware and integrated society. And then we have, what is the carbon footprint of tourists in country? And there may be opportunities through the electrification of short haul flight, through better resourced electrified ground transportation and public transportation that actually reduces the emissions footprint of in-country tourists, and even for New Zealanders on tour in our own country. But the shape of the industry is going to be different than it was 6 months ago. I don't think we're going to see a return to massive growth in mass market, low cost tourism to New Zealand. So the sector needs to figure out how to either reduce or redeploy capacity. And maybe we should have auctions of tourist visas, so that, like national parks in the US, you actually control numbers so that everybody who does get to come has an experience worth coming for.
Sure. A lot of challenges to consider there then. And, kind of speaking of those challenges, it's really interesting kind of hearing you discuss the various forms of renewable energy and the challenges that are presented with those. We've had a question submitted in terms of what are your thoughts then on tidal renewable energy, and is that an option for New Zealand?
So as a lay person, I always love the idea of tidal, because it looks like something for nothing. I mean, nothing is for nothing. You're going to still have to have the mechanization that captures the energy. But if you look at the tide flows, particularly through Cook Strait, you think if there was some way of harnessing that energy, that would be pretty exciting. The experiment up in the Kaipara Harbour of the Harbour Head flow is another one. It turns out a couple of things are against us. It turns out there are relatively few nations in the world for whom tidal flow, which would represent a significant source of energy. And therefore the research and development costs are not likely to be borne by the countries with the largest capacity to undertake that research and development. It's not surprising, for example, that the US developed hydropower technology because it had these massive inland rivers. It's not entirely surprising that the French have pushed ahead with nuclear power because they don't have many alternative sources. The challenge for New Zealand is that if tidal flows were to be harnessed, there are very few wealthy countries in the world that are likely to stand to substantially benefit from that technology. So there is very limited research, limited, not non-existent, going on about how you would harness the power of something like Cook Strait. So we benefit from the world's investment in wind turbines and solar panel arrays, but unfortunately we're not looking like benefiting substantially from investments in research and development of tidal flow.
Sure. And we've had this question submitted, but I'm also personally really interested to hear your thoughts on this, as it's kind of a discussion that's very reoccurring, and obviously in globally there's been some experiments on this sort of thing. Do you see universal basic income kind of having a role in climate action?
Not particularly, to be honest. I mean, I've got lots of views about lots of things, but I think in terms of climate, the universal basic income is a social policy instrument that needs to be evaluated alongside a large range of complex ways in which we redistribute purchasing power in Western democracies. Sure.
I guess tying that into some other questions that have kind of been proposed, you know, when you talk about consumer preferences and consumer choices and having products and services that are a little bit more expensive because they have less embedded carbon, do you think there's potential for a universal basic income to empower people to move towards those sort of choices when they might not be able to kind of afford to do so otherwise?
To the extent that affordability is a constraint on households, then the more you relax the constraint, the wider their degree of genuine choice. But a household that was facing the constraint and relief from the universal basic income may actually choose to invest more in fill in the butt, more food, more clothing, more shelter, more education. And it may not choose to pay a higher price that reflects the embedded emitted carbon in products and services.
Sure. And so moving on to another set of questions here, particularly around local government versus kind of central government. You know, what are their roles, you know, versus one another in getting ready for the impacts of climate change on New Zealand as you see them?
I think local government is right in the front line of adaptation. I think national central government is right in the front line for emissions reduction, pricing, regulation, and so forth. But I think when it comes to adaptation, the warmer, wetter, windier world that we're in manifests itself very differently in different regions of New Zealand. And each region needs to be able to develop an understanding of the impacts of climate change on its infrastructure and the people who live and work in those regions, and needs to develop plans that would support adaptation. Now, some of this is really hard, partly because local governments are of varying scales, from quite large to very small. That means they have varying resources and competencies to deploy against this challenge. In addition, some regions may benefit from climate change. Others may be substantially disadvantaged from climate change. So losses lying where they fall may not be equitable between regions. And the final part of this puzzle is, in some cases, the right answer may be to protect local communities and infrastructure against the impacts of climate change. But in other cases, it may be to retreat from the seashore, retreat from the river mouth, retreat from the river bank, retreat from the lakeside. Retreat is very, very difficult for political leaders, because it basically says to a community, we either cannot afford or we choose not to afford protection. And now how are you going to compensate, and who are you going to compensate those who suffer loss as a result of your choice to retreat?
So how can we stimulate more empathy and care for our climate now and in the future in all New Zealanders?
Well, first of all, the science is pretty clear, but more science is not going to change. The people who are prepared to be persuaded by the science know the science and have been persuaded. Our political leadership, without objection, passed the legislation giving birth to our domestic target and to the Climate Change Commission. So from that point of view, we are making some of the moves that would be needed. But it is going to take a massive commitment of energy and time and talent. And it is going to come with some dissonance and disaffection. And so the question is, how do you engage people in the emotional side of a willingness to change? Because the intellectual debate is largely done. That we know the climate science, we know what fossil fuel emissions are doing to the atmosphere and the oceans. More evidence of that will simply reassure those who already believe it that they're right, and is not persuading those who don't believe it to change their behaviours. I think we will know we are making progress when we see the arts in our music, in our paintings, in our poetry begin to galvanise an emotional response from communities, where it is about the world we're going to leave for our grandchildren and the unborn generations to come. When we care about our grandchildren asking us in 2050, so what did you do to save the planet? And if you can't answer that question, then I think you will be part of the failure. If you can answer the question for your grandchildren, so what did you do? And you can answer that in any way at all, then that will be a contribution worth making.
Absolutely. And I understand too, you mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of referencing your granddaughter, I believe. It sounds like for you, that's been a real core motivation, and also, in discussing this with your children. I wondered if you might talk to that point a little bit and expand on your kind of personal motivation.
Anzac, yeah. Well, look, a couple of things, and some of it's already in the public domain, but I retired from full-time executive leadership when I came to the end of my 10 years at the University of Canterbury in February 2019, and we then took the long-haul flight to New York and hung out there for a time, and I flew back and went to a couple of board meetings and then flew back again, and life was as it had been, and I would say that I was aware of, but not highly engaged in, the climate change conversation, like the vast majority of people. I was aware, but not active. Then I was approached to ask whether I would put myself forward to be considered for the role of chair of the Climate Change Commission. And as I'm off to do, I kind of floated that idea at the dinner table with my adult children. And they were pretty adamant that you could quit all that ASB directorship, Otakaro, and all those other crazy crap things you were doing, but you did not have the right not to put yourself forward, and if chosen, to serve in the role of chair of the Climate Change Commission. That was the end of retirement.
Sounds like you didn't have a choice. Beautiful. I mean, I guess hopefully through our kind of startup ventures, we'll be trying to put the pressure on primary school students to put the pressure on their parents, and maybe have similar course of action.
You look at the great social movements, that they are slightly economic, but the abolition of slavery, right, which all of us would now today say, how did we ever allow it, caused substantial economic dislocation and was compensated for by the British government, right? But it's a social change now that we sort of look at and think, did you ever think this was an acceptable thing? Child labour. We don't accept that there is any price at which you should empower and enable child labour in our society today in New Zealand. So sometimes we do just galvanise ourselves around things and we say, we're not doing that at any price. And we are going to do these other things, whatever the cost. So New Zealand's nuclear stand in the 1980s, nobody did the cost-benefit analysis of telling the Americans not to bring their boats, right? We didn't go, well, we're going to lose this trade deal and that'd be quite expensive and maybe we're better off if we look the other way. No, at that moment in our history, we made a decision for other reasons. And I think climate change, yeah, we can run cost-benefit analysis and we can say why renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. The fact is we should stop emitting CO2 equivalents as soon as we can to the greatest extent possible while still feeding people.
And I eagerly await the day and the time that we, you know, turn to, just like you're saying, for example, I guess plastic producers, and go, well, you know, we've known this isn't okay for a long time, and you know, at what point did you guys think it was okay to be, you know, continuing that?
Stuff everywhere, yeah. And the plastic bag thing, while it's little, is quite informative, because remember we went through that brief transition where the supermarkets were charging 5 cents a bag. It really didn't change behaviours much, right? Because you go, oh, 5 cents, whatever, I forgot my bag, right? But when they just banned them, then surprisingly, actually the world survived without them. So there are times when you just say, no, it's not about price. It's just about choice. And we choose not.
And I guess we saw the emergence of all these alternatives as well. And, you know, that's something where we kind of, it seemed like we didn't have the R&D be put into, you know, alternatives prior to plastic bags being banned, because it wasn't an incentive for those producers.
Yeah.
You know, how do you see that kind of influencing things in the future? And do you think it's, you know, really necessary?
I do think there is a role for just simply not doing some things.
Yeah.
There is not a price at which you should be allowed to do it. It's something we would choose not to do. And that may mean there are some industries that leave New Zealand. And that may mean that there are some people who choose to live here and bring their talents here because of those choices. And it will be very difficult always to tot up on one side of the ledger what you got and tot up on the other side of the ledger what you missed out on. But there are some guiding principles, I think, that are helpful. And that's why I use that beacon of saying, how would you answer your grandchild's question? It's a bit like we used to have a test of, if this appeared on the front page of the Dominion newspaper, or if you told your mother that, what would she think? Some of those moral questions are best answered by putting yourself in that position, not by saying, well, we did it because we thought it would make a profit, or we did it because we thought it would cost less. We did do it, or we did not do it because it was the right thing to do.
Absolutely. So again, in reference to grandchildren, and I suppose all of the University of Canterbury students watching, and young climate strikers, what part do you see young people playing in addressing climate change now and in the future? I suppose an extension to what we've already seen.
Well, first of all, I am the child of Generation Zero, because it was Gen Zero that got the momentum behind the act which created the Climate Change Commission. So I have absolutely no doubt about the power of youth to shape the future agenda. And I think that Gen Zero showed how you can do that by being part of the institutions without becoming institutionalized. That working with the organs of government proved in their case from zero to hero was 2 years to get an act of parliament which essentially took a giant leap forward in public awareness and political accountability for things that could make a difference. So the power of youth is often that they haven't been told why they can't do something or why that won't work. And all power to creativity, innovation, and momentum, because we need all of those over the next decades to address the issues of climate change.
Fantastic. And so obviously, you know, so climate anxiety is a huge topic at the moment, and certainly very real. Do you have any words of wisdom for people who are sort of terrified of climate change?
Well, first of all, I'm an optimist by nature. Look, the world has faced challenges which at the time seemed to be insurmountable. For my generation growing up, it was the threat of nuclear holocaust. It was literally the posters and the jokes were, you know, if you hear the nuclear air raid alarm, put your head between your knees and kiss your ass goodbye, right? Over, and nothing you can do about it. Now that was a real and present danger, and continues to be a real danger, although not so much top of mind today. But it took a massive amount of political effort and will to constrain, and that's all it has. It hasn't eliminated the spread of nuclear arms and the tolerance the global community would have for their use by any nation state. So I think there are amazingly positive and constructive things that society has done. If we look at the social agenda of the 70s and 80s, the movement from the tight-lit lockdown 1970 regime, where homosexuality was a crime, where we were intolerant of minorities, which is not to say we're perfect today, where gender equity had yet to become anything like the mainstream issue it became. It's not to say we've fixed all those things, but in 40 years we have made substantial progress in creating a better society. Have we, in the process of some of those reforms, created inequities around income and poverty? We have. And do we recognize that? We do. Have we found interventions at a scale that are effective in dealing with that problem? No. Does it mean we should stop and give up? No. Should we be optimistic that we can do better? Yes. And I think you can paint a picture of a brighter, cleaner, greener, more resilient and more sustainable world by 2050 than the one we have today. It's not about simply avoiding it being worse than it is, as if this was the high tide mark. We can imagine a world that is better than it is today, that is healthier, brighter, cleaner, and greener. And that's a world that we should all strive for. And that's a source of optimism.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Because the next question was, what are you optimistic about? But I feel like you've covered that pretty well and truly. We're getting the nudge under the table to wrap it up soon. So I just wanted to ask, I guess, are there any other points that you'd like to address and discuss and put out there before we sort of finish?
I, first of all, would like to thank all of those who have signed in and stayed on for the duration of this conversation. That's a feat of endurance for all of you, so well done. Secondly, I would say that all of us can make a difference. Absolutely. It is not up to others. It's not one of those things where you can say, if you do this, if government did that, if industry did that, then the world would be saved. Now, each of us has got a small part to play. Mine may be in how we conduct our household, where I travel, how I discharge my responsibilities for the Climate Change Commission. Yours will be different. You will have a different agenda and program where you can make a difference. Who you talk to, what you say, how you go about your daily life, who you vote for, who you empower. All of those are things that each one of you can influence 20 or 50 others. And those will influence others, and that will change the world for the better.
So then, I guess as a recurring theme, it's about looking at everything through that climate change perspective and through that climate change lens. But again, discussing climate anxiety, not to do so in a negative way, but in with the view of optimism and passion. So that's fantastic.
Not just avoid a disaster. We can make it a better world than it is today.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity for not only me, or everyone else to ask you questions and hear your thoughts. It's been incredibly valuable. Thank you for having me along. In addition to that, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Anzac. Lovely opportunity. Yeah.
Hello. So thank you both for your contributions there. It was a really, really interesting conversation to be allowed to be a fly on the wall for. Thank you everyone who is present and was present for all of the questions you submitted. It was really you guys providing the fuel for this fire. So we really appreciate that. I'll do my obligatory follow UC Centre for Entrepreneurship on Facebook. This is part of a series of webinars that the UC School of Business is putting on. So there'll be more interesting sort of content and conversations and questions and answers and all sorts coming up in the future. So sign up to our newsletters, follow us on social media, reach out and keep an eye out for the next one. Thank you all very much.